Hey there. For almost a year now, folks have been constantly asking me to talk about Peter Zeihan. Zeihan is a geopolitical analyst who I think is kind of in a similar camp to myself. He's a huge skeptic of the idea that we in the United States have to be terrified of China or that U.S. power is fading away. I started looking into his stuff about a year ago. I follow him on Twitter. I've probably listened to half a dozen podcast interviews with him at this point. And I developed sort of a standard critique that I was giving in the comments when people asked him about it. Last week, somebody asked me about it during a live stream, and I thought it would be fun to sort of slice that out and just present it as an independent video, obviously not charging patrons or anything. But I did want to say, before I get into this, which is very hemming and hawing and occasionally seems quite negative, I actually do take Peter Zeihan fairly seriously, and that's, I think, why I'm advancing this critique. I think he probably does a better job of talking about what's going on in the world than anybody at, like, the Harvard Kennedy School or the Council on Foreign Relations or, like, certainly any Washington, D.C. think tank. So I think he gets some very big things right, but I think there's also some problems with his analysis, and I don't think I made it quite as clear as I should have that I'm not dismissing the guy here. I'm just complaining on the internet, which is what I do. So without further ado, here is sort of three things that I think that Peter Zeihan gets wrong with his geopolitical analysis.
Question, Rob, what do you think of Peter Zeihan's assertion that the U.S. will essentially slip into isolationism 2.0 soon? And this will radically destabilize world trade and politics. Man, Peter Zeihan. People love to talk about Peter Zeihan, and I understand why. Because he is compelling. He gives great talks. He's iconoclastic. He dismisses things in really amusing ways. I admire his approach to things. I have a lot to learn from him. I think as a public intellectual, dramatically more successful than I am. But I think he's really, the way he looks at things is dramatically oversimplified. I think there's a lot of weaknesses to the way that Peter Zeihan looks at the world. There's some strengths too. I think I'm somebody who does not believe that China is anywhere near as powerful as advertised by the Pentagon or the Chinese Communist Party yet. I do not believe they're that powerful yet. I do not believe that they are as threatening as advertised yet. I do not believe that. And it's usually if I'm talking about like a geopolitics analyst, I'm usually 100% in Peter Zeihan's camp because I'm like, it's ridiculous the way that you're overselling this Chinese threat. However, I would say that that Peter Zeihan goes way further in the direction of China's not a threat than I would. Like, I do believe that, like, the 21st century is going to be about competition between the United States and China. Like, that makes sense to me. And the I don't want to minimize, and the coalition of allies that each of them is able to construct, because that coalition of allies will be much more important than it was in former conflicts, because we actually do have, God, I don't want to sound like Thomas Friedman here, but we do have not a more equal world, like a world is flat, but we have a world where the arenas are not as easily flattened by the Soviets or the US or by the European imperial forces before them. You can see that with Africa. In the 19th century, the Europeans were able to just rampage in there and knock everybody over. In the 20th century, the US and the Soviet Union had to sort of compete, within each country with, the factions that they supported, and, you couldn't just set up an empire anymore. In the 21st century, China and the United States are actually going to have to make, like, real trade deals and concessions and whatnot, like, with real national actors in Africa. So that's the trajectory that I think is going on. But the broad coalitions, the broad competition, I think still will. It won't be like the Cold War, where it's just really like, the US versus the Soviets and just killing everybody in the way. Like it's going to be where like there will be competing blocks, and they will be the U.S. and China will be the most important of those blocks. There will be competition between them. That will be one of the defining factors of the 20th century. Peter Zeihan really just thinks that China's a paper tiger. It's going to blow away because on all of history, China has never been unified for more than like, 100 years. I think Zeihan, so a lot of what he says is really interesting. And I think it is a good corrective to the way a lot of people look at this competition. But it is, I think I've dealt with this enough times that I think I put it in comments. Like there's like, yeah, the two biggest problems with Zeihan are oil and gas. I think he comes from Stratfor, which is a Texas thing. He's spent his entire life, I think, probably doing consulting work for oil and gas companies, strategic stuff. And I think, as with a lot of people in that industry, he sort of believes that renewables don't mean anything, that solar and wind are just a stupid, and electric cars, that's all just sort of a stupid pipe dream, and that's meaningless. And what really matters is oil and gas, and the fact that China is dependent on other people for their oil and gas means that China is just going to fall apart, and it needs the United States for everything. That's only one aspect. And in Zeihan's defense, that's been true of renewable sources for all of human history, or all of the 50, 60-year history when we've been talking of renewables until about 2015. And the thing is, like, that's really changing and really changing rapidly. And I don't think Zeihan has incorporated that into his analysis yet. And once he does incorporate that into his analysis, he's gonna be like, oh, wait a second, like, fuck, like, actually, like 20, 30 years from now, like, China's gonna be just fine, and kind of self-sufficient with wind, sun, and the mountains and mountains of coal that they have. Like, that'll be enough. And this idea that China's just going to dry up and blow away if the U.S. Navy stops guaranteeing oil lanes, like, that's just not true. And I think there's three things. He's too close to oil and gas, doesn't understand that. Second is history. He just does not understand history. I think he's got an interesting grasp and an interesting interpretation on the United States. I think he very accurately puts the United States at the center of the imperial story since World War II. It should be at the center of the imperial story before that as well. From basically, it was a U.S.-run system from 1917 on. The U.S. just didn't choose to run it. But before that, he doesn't understand anything. He doesn't understand that actually the system before 1917 was a British-run system, to the same extent that the system since has been a U.S. system. He has this idea, before 1917, it was all forever. It was empires competing, and sort of he draws some silly lessons from that. Also, not understanding history and the incredible importance of the Industrial Revolution, the way that it changed absolutely everything. It was the Industrial Revolution that made a worldwide empire or a worldwide system possible. That's why the British were able to do what they did, and why the U.S. was able to follow sort of directly in their footsteps. That's something that I think Zeihan misses, and that's why his looking at Chinese history and being like, China was never unified for very long, and it always falls apart under its own weight. Well, you could never have a country the size of the United States before the Industrial Revolution either. You could never have a country the size of modern Russia before the Industrial Revolution. You could never have empires like the British Empire or the French Empire. It just didn't. It wasn't a possibility, and we're living in a very different historical era, and I don't think Zeihan really quite grasps that. That's another thing that Zeihan gets wrong. And the third thing is just contempt. It's kind of funny, and I think it's part of his appeal, actually. But he really just seems to have a real contempt for anybody in the world who's not American. And I think it really comes through in ways that are offensive to me. But I think can also, just it's fun to be like, fuck everybody, America first. There's a reason he gets a lot of, it's this idea that, and I think he's not wrong about the centrality of the U.S. to the current world system. Absolutely not wrong about that. But his assumption that the whole world's just going to fall apart without the guiding hand of the United States is wrong. I think that China, everybody in the world has reserves of strength and power that means that they will mean something without the U.S. World system. And I don't think Zeihan's assumption that we're going to fall into I don't think that Zeihan's assumption that we're going to fall into isolationism again holds much water. I just don't see it. Like I would love to see us backing the fuck out of the Middle East, militarily speaking, but that doesn't mean we're going to stop policing sea lanes. It doesn't mean we're going to stop, we're going to back off of our banking and financial hegemony. I see zero indication of it. Just as one example of things that Zeihan gets wrong, at the beginning of the COVID thing, sort of when I was listening to a lot of his podcasts, he was like, all right, this is it. Here we go. Like the whole supply chain, like China's fucked now, like all the supply chains coming back to the United States. That's what's happening right now. Everybody's doing industrial policy. Like it's all like that. It's happening as we speak. My contacts, it's happening. This is, March, April, May, June of last year. Well, here we are in March of 2021. China's had one of its biggest export years ever, largely on the back of the United States CARES Act, in fact. It turns out like this much ballyhooed end of globalization, end of dispersed industry. It's just not happening. I think like to an extent it is, for sure. Like, yeah, like it does look like we're going to shift some factories to Vietnam or, but some of that is mostly just stuff that was happening already because China moved up the value chain and doesn't, it's not the cheapest place to make the dumbest stuff anymore. I think there's a lot. I think Zeihan provides a very useful corrective to a lot of insane paranoia about China, but I think he goes too far, and I think he's got sort of a real contempt for the national aspirations, the national capabilities of not just the Chinese, but really everybody in the world who is an American, and I find that distasteful. I can totally I'm probably just gonna grab that and put that out as Peter Zeihan, a critique. That's a video that could probably do pretty well. I mean, hey, channel's not doing that well. Might as well start a what's the word? What the rappers? What do the rappers do? Feud or something? Yeah. Anyway, that said, I think Peter Zeihan's a really interesting guy, and I think he makes geopolitics interesting and fun. And he's also a heterodox thinker, which is something we desperately need more of. And it's nice to see a heterodox thinker, as I think of myself as, being more broadly successful, which I am not. Anyway, okay, talked about that for a long time.